Hey everyone, this is Chris Barbeau again coming back at you from Broker Corner, residential real estate broker in the state of California. I want to talk about a pretty significant change in the way tenants are handled when making a property or an offer on a residential real estate property. And it has to do with the form, and it ties into the new residential purchase agreement, which was released last month by the California Association of Realtors. So let's first start with the RPA, the residential purchase agreement, and how it's going to work with the residential purchase agreement. So jumping right in, I'm going to scroll down to the section of the contract where it talks about tenants. So on the new RPA, in what I like to call the grid here, there is a section here it is under section M, possession, and it's section M3, tenant occupied units. So it'll say see tenant occupied property addendum, which is the new form, the TOPA. And you're going to check a box here if it's tenant occupied. Notice it doesn't say is the tenant staying, it's saying is it occupied. So the big change, and let me scroll down to where it references the addendum as well. Oops, come on now. I'm going down, not up here. Oh, thank you, Sky Slope. Scroll down, sorry about that. Okay. Down on the contract, you'll notice there's also a box here that needs to be checked on section 4, property addendum. Tenant occupied property addendum should be checked whether current tenants will remain or not. So the old RPA had a whole section about tenant occupied properties, and by default they were going to be out within 5 days prior to close, and you didn't have to worry about it on the old contract really if the tenant was leaving. Well, now you're going to use this addendum whether they're leaving or not. So you're going to reference it in the two sections I just showed you in the grid and also here on section 4A. So let's jump right into that form and let's take a look at it. By the way, if I didn't say this before, it's replacing the TIP form, which was the tenant in possession form that we used to have. We're no longer using that form, we're using this one. So if you jump right into the form, it's an addendum to the purchase agreement. Obviously, you're filling in the date, the address, the parties. By default, it assumes, and I'm going to uncheck these for right now, by default, it assumes the tenant is going to stay. So if we look at section 1A, which by default says tenant to remain in possession, buyers shall take property subject to the rights of the existing tenants and under the terms and conditions specified in paragraph 2 down below. Jumping to section 2, it addresses deposits and unearned rent. Basically, that's being prorated in escrow by default. Some other things that you want to look at here, if there's any changes while you're in escrow to leases or anything like that, you're going to have to disclose that to the new buyer. That needs to be disclosed to the buyer. Talks about personal property that is included in the sale. It addresses rent agreements and leases. Those have to be given to the buyer within the first 7 days. I highly recommend you check these two boxes, one for income and expense statements, particularly if it's 2 or more units and you're an investor, you're probably going to want to see that. Tenant estoppel certificates, I'm a big advocate for those. This is a document that the tenant signs to confirm what they believe are the terms of their lease and what items they may or may not own. You don't want to buy a property, close on it, and have the tenant come up later and say, hey, by the way, did you know my rent was reduced by $50 last month? Or I own the refrigerator. And these are things you want to know up in advance. So definitely you want to get these completed by the tenant. So that's if the tenant is going to stay. In most cases, the tenant may be leaving. And so in that case, you're going to check 1B here, property to be delivered vacant. Or if there's specific units, maybe it's multi-unit and only 2 of the units are going to be vacant, you're going to designate which ones are going to be vacant here. Otherwise, you're checking the box. This can be blank if, the whole property is delivered vacant. But here's one of the bigger changes, I think, also is right here in section 2. So previously under the TIP, and the RPA really, under the old RPA, if the tenant didn't move out, the seller was basically in breach. They had agreed to deliver that property vacant within 5 days prior to close by default. If they're not able to do that, they were breaching the agreement. And now you have an issue between the buyer and the seller. So I do like this paragraph that was added that essentially says, if the seller, after exercising good faith, attempts, and subject to applicable law, is unable to remove the tenant by close of escrow, or 5 days before close of escrow, which I recommend checking that if you're on the buying side, for sure you want to check that. The buyer can cancel the agreement and their sole remedy will be the return of the deposit. This now essentially says that if the seller can't, they've tried to deliver it vacant, but the tenant won't move out or whatever, really the buyer's recourse is to cancel and get their deposit back. So this is a change to the way tenants are handled, and it sounds like it's a good change to me. You're on the buying side, you're going to check that, you're going to check this, and that's pretty much it. So you do want to make sure you have this agreement, because if there's a tenant in there and you haven't checked the box on the RPA that references this addendum, you haven't really addressed the issue. So 2 big changes. You need the form. Number 1, you need the form whether you have a tenant or not. And number 2, if you're using this form and it's to be delivered vacant and the seller can't get the tenant out, the buyer's recourse is to cancel and get their deposit back, less any fees that they might have put out of pocket. So hopefully that helps. I think these are probably good changes, but it is another form that we didn't necessarily need before if the tenant was leaving. So let me know what you think of this form. You can put some comments below. I'll respond back to them, but hopefully this was helpful. And as I like to say to a lot of our agents when they ask me, about certain situations in real estate, there's usually a form for it. So there's definitely a form for that. When there's a tenant involved, there's a form for that. So hopefully this was helpful. Reach out if you have any questions. In the meantime, we will see you in escrow. Thanks.